being outlaws is in our DNA. That's what it is to be American. We're always the rebel opposition. We're always outnumbered. We're always hated. We're also feared and respected. I wouldn't have things any other way. I'm having a good time.
All right, welcome back to the Greene Tavern. As always, I'm your host, Horatius, joined by my co-host, Mr. Appalachian Huggy Knot, and our special guest, Zoomer Historian. Mr. Zoomer, how are you doing today?
Hello, I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Fantastic.
Good as well.
It's good to have you back on. Really wanted to dive into your Rhodesia series. I've always been a huge Rhodesia boo. For years at this point, my room is covered in various Rhodesian posters. So I saw a while back that you've been working on this Rhodesia series, and I figured it'd be great to bring you on to talk about it. So, how did the series start for you? What drew you to Rhodesia? What got you interested, and made you want to do a series on it?
Well, obviously, always been interested in the British Empire because it kind of comes naturally for any right-wing Anglo. But the Rhodesia thing, I don't know. It was going to be a one-off video initially, but then I saw how much interest there was in it, and I became even more fascinated in it because it's something you hear about, but no one really knows that much. But once I started looking into it myself, it was like, wow, there's a lot here, and actually a lot of parallels, especially the racial elements and the sort of liberal elements when it comes to the negotiations with the West and such. So it just sort of kept growing, and I was going to make a very long video, and then it became so long. I was like, I should just make this a book, and I approached Antelope Hill, and it became not only a very long video. Oh well, now it's a series. I'm on Substack, but it also became a book.
That's awesome. So, and what's the scope of your book?
Well, I realized there wasn't really a sort of complete history out there. The closest thing is Rhodesia by Peter Baxter, but it's very disjointed. There's a lot of mistakes. I think there's a lot of gaps in there, so that there just isn't really a book which covers like the whole sweep of Rhodesian history properly. So I was like, oh, that's basically what I'm doing anyway. I may as well, make it a book since there's a gap for it, and I would love to make it. So
That's fantastic. Well, Yeah, let's go ahead and dive into Rhodesia. So, in your mind, where does Rhodesia start? Is it the pioneer column? Is it Cecil Rhodes? Does it go back further than that?
I begin the series when Cecil Rhodes arrives in South Africa because, well, obviously the story kind of, you can't really tell the story of Rhodesia without Rhodes. But I mean, ultimately, when I really jump into detail and start the story properly, it's 1890 when the pioneer column goes into Mashonaland.
And why did the pioneer column go north?
Well, there was a multitude of reasons. The reason it happened at that specific moment really was there was fears from the British to some degree about the Germans who were the newcomers in Africa at that point. They just moved into Namibia, and the Boers were making it very clear that they wanted to link up with the Germans or push north. And Cecil Rhodes, who had his dream of going all the way up north and securing Central Africa for Britain, thought that Britain was not working fast enough at preventing that. So he sort of took things into his own hands and arranged to get a charter so he could go north on behalf of Britain. So that's when he decided to jump in himself and sort of cut off the Germans to the west from the Boers, sort of to the east.
So the Rhodesians go north. They start to settle, and then there's a series of two wars with the Matabele that sort of solidify
Yep.
their hold. So how did those go?
So the first war, the first Matabele War began. There was sort of a weird, precarious situation where the settlers were settling in the east of what became Rhodesia, which is Mashonaland, which is the majority tribe of Rhodesia, but they were sort of a subject people of the Matabele, who were in the west of Rhodesia, and there was the whole Matabele economy kind of worked by endless slave raids into the east of the country. So there was a lot of friction between the settlers who weren't a big fan of their sort of African labor being constantly slave raided or murdered by the Matabele from the west, and it just kept happening again and again. And eventually, there was a particularly big incident after one raid where the settlers had enough and war broke out, which neither side particularly wanted. But the Lobengula, the Matabele king, couldn't control his men, and the Europeans couldn't continue to exist that way if their labor kept getting scared or dying. So war became inevitable. And they crossed the border into Matabele land, and in two big battles, they completely annihilated the Africans who just sort of wildly charged, like you'd see in like the movie Zulu or whatever, and they just got obliterated. And the Matabele capital, Bulawayo, got captured with ease. There was one loss in the end where the Rhodesians had to chase down the Matabele king, Lobengula, but they got cut off, and the Shangani patrol, as it was known, got killed to a man. But other than that, it was a complete walkover. And the second war essentially was the Matabele rose up and tried to kick the whites out of the country, and they killed 10% of the entire white population. So they sort of went for the isolated farmsteads, like massacred the children and the women wherever they could. And yeah, 10% of the whites died. But once the whites sort of consolidated in the major cities, it was a bit of a wrap, and they once again just sort of swept the floor with these Africans didn't really have any tactics besides like just charging at you en masse. And after that, there wasn't any real African resistance for a long time, or for well over half a century. They just sort of settled in and accepted it after that point.
Yeah, so just to jump ahead a little bit, I guess it's so we have roughly 50, 60 years of just the status quo. What changed to sort of make the Africans rise up later on? It seems like they were just sort of content, I guess, with the status quo after the Second War, and were just fine with living with it. What changed?
Yeah, so they just sort of accepted their lot in life, but ultimately it was the Second World War that changed everything. Obviously, politically for everyone in the world, the massive sort of swing to the left and all the propaganda during the war of us like sort of slandering everything racial or nationalist as bad. It became very hard to justify this like essentially racial empire we had across the world, and liberals really had a field day at that point. The Africans were getting all their dreams of independence, and they finally saw some hope. Suddenly, like the idea came to their head of we can actually throw off the white man, and they had their African nationalists telling them they could do that, and the liberals and the churches to a lot of degrees, and they just sort of felt like they had a chance and they had hope, really. Before that, they just sort of accepted it because they respected the strength or whatever of the white man. But after that, it was clear that sort of the white man's will to rule was sort of declining, and in all the other countries, Britain was just sort of letting go of her empire, handing over all the non-settler colonies back, like nothing happened. And then the Rhodesian Africans wanted their country back as well, and it was very hard to justify not doing so for Britain. So the Africans were sort of egged on the whole way.
Was the Rhodesian colony intended to be a settler colony?
Yeah. Rhodes specifically said that you should look upon this land as your own, and like this is a white country, but obviously you can't just expel the blacks because they needed them for their labor. The whole way Rhodesia worked was maintaining a very high white standard of living, so they didn't flood themselves with immigration. They wanted to maintain like quality over quantity. They didn't want the poor white problem, as they called it, of that South Africa had. So the white numbers were kept relatively low, and the Africans did these sort of like menial jobs of hard labor like mining and such, but also like housework and things like that. They just didn't have the poor whites to do those things.
Interesting. So to back it up a little bit more. So at the start, the Rhodesians, it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was under company rule, the BSAC, for 25, 30 years or so until they were declared a dominion. What was life like under company rule, and then why did the transition occur?
Yeah, so it was so they were under company rule from 1890 till 1923, and then they became a self-governing colony. They never became a dominion, although they otherwise they never would have had to declare independence. But ultimately, once Rhodes died, the company was sort of detested because I believe it was 50% of all mining profits or something ridiculous like that they would get from the settlers, and there was all these like ridiculous financial constraints and like kind of rather high taxation. I think that they were just resented massively by the settlers, and it bubbled up over time. But by 1923, pretty much everyone had enough, and the referendum to get rid of them was won in a landslide.
And what was the Rhodesian contribution to the First World War? Did that contribute to the referendum, to anything else? Like how many Rhodesians participated in all that?
Yeah, so in both world wars, actually, the Rhodesians contributed a higher percentage of manpower than anywhere else, and they were actually the first in the Second War, definitely, but I think the first as well. They were like the first to declare war immediately right after Britain. So I mean, the shared experience of the First World War, like I guess, helped solidify, created like some national myths and such, but I'm not sure how much it contributed to independence. That was sort of something that was bubbling up anyway. But the company handling of conscription and such wasn't great. There wasn't any conscription in the end, and the settlers didn't think they were doing enough during the war. So I mean, maybe it had something to do with that, but it just seemed like a natural process, really.
In both world wars, where were they fighting primarily? In the First World War, were they mostly chasing down von Lettow-Vorbeck, or were they in Europe? Same thing in the Second War, Europe, Pacific, etc.
Yeah, so in the First War, the Rhodesians were grouped up into the First Rhodesia Regiment was sent to Namibia, where they didn't actually see much action. They just sort of chased the Germans a bit, and then that front wound down pretty quickly. But upon their return home, a lot of them just sort of went off to Europe and signed up on their own. But others joined the Second Rhodesia Regiment, which went to East Africa, and they spent the rest of the war chasing down the endlessly elusive Germans for the entire war, and taking ridiculous casualties, mostly from disease. Like they were just ravaged by disease endlessly. Like each man was injured or put out of action like 10 times each or something ridiculous, just like endless cycles of disease. It was actually like a lot of the younger men just couldn't take it. Like the sort of older, more hardy types actually, did a lot better. But yeah, that was what they did for the most part. There was a lot of, as I said, individual sign-ups that went to Europe and signed up in like normal British regiments. But yeah, in terms of like an organized war effort, they were in East Africa. And in the Second War, in order to prevent sort of like a mass casualty event like they had in East Africa, they just sort of spread out all over the place. Like wherever there was fighting, there was Rhodesians. They were just sort of spread out around the world, really. Well, not so much in the Pacific, but all over. Well, North Africa especially, and also Italy. But they predominated in the skies. Like Ian Smith was a fighter pilot, and there was a lot of famous Rhodesian fighter pilots. Like Bomber Harris used to live in Rhodesia and all sorts. And disproportionately, they were officers because they were good at ruling people because they had so much experience ruling blacks, or like large groups of blacks, especially on farms and such. So they were sort of seen as natural officers. So disproportionately all over the place, you'd find Rhodesians as officers.
And they had their own SAS squadron, if I'm not mistaken. That became the Rhodesian SAS.
Yeah, that was later in Malaya, during the insurgency in Malaya. So that would be 52, something like that. There were so many Rhodesians there that they had their own SAS squadron formed in Malaya.
So how was the country progressing in this period, starting with becoming a self-governing colony and going forward? How was the economy developing, cities, farms, etc.?
Yeah, so there were still only tens of thousands of settlers after the First World War, and things continued steadily up until the Second World War. But it was really during the Second World War when there's just such a massive demand for sort of what like Rhodesia's raw materials, and also Rhodesia had a massive air training scheme in their borders because obviously Britain, not the best place to train while it's being bombed or whatever. So there were so many people going through Rhodesia during this time that a lot of people had their first taste of what Rhodesia was actually like, because during the Empire, the average person back home in Britain didn't know the first thing about the Empire. They didn't it wasn't really on the radar for a lot of people. But a lot of people had their first taste, and after World War II was when in those sort of like first 5, 10, 15 years was when things just sort of exploded. Like the population doubled or even tripled, and all the major industries took off, and especially the tobacco industry. Rhodesia just sort of exploded economically after that point. And the two major cities as well became huge, Salisbury and Bulawayo.
So when did the rumblings of the conflict start to pick back up?
As in, when did the unrest start with Africans?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in 1953, it looked like Rhodesia might gain their independence, but instead they decided to go for this project with Northern Rhodesia, which is a separate colony to Southern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland, and they formed a federation. The British were sort of worried that Rhodesia would drift into South Africa's orbit, and they wanted a sort of less racially extreme, like Central African sort of bloc. So they formed this federation, and this sounds like a great idea, sort of economically and everything else. There's only a few people that were, ringing the alarm bells, like, hey, it won't always be like this. What if Britain screws us over or whatever? But no one was listening at that point, and they formed this federation. And given that the 60s were around the corner, things moved quickly in terms of like a global swing to the left. And within like 5 to 7 years, the other two colonies, the protectorate of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, were both sort of drowning in African unrest, and African nationalism had completely taken root. And there was only like tens of thousands of whites in Northern Rhodesia and barely any at all in Nyasaland. And they both sort of fell very quickly to African nationalism, and the British just kept sort of cucking out and screwing over the whites in both of those places. So the federation imploded, which just left Rhodesia sort of on her own, and her Africans were sort of, looking over their shoulder, like behind them at their neighbors, and thinking, oh, right, that could be us. And they were receiving, all these nationalist groups were receiving like massive funding from like places like Egypt and like the Soviet Union and China, and sort of like massive unrest sort of broke out in around 1960 really. And if you were an African and you didn't support African nationalism, your door is just going to get kicked in, or your hut is going to get burned down, and like they will just kill you. So it was like a massive terror campaign, not so much against whites, but more so against their own people from the Africans and all their little sort of, well, not shanty towns, but they had these townships on the edges of the cities, and they were just rife with violence of just these African nationalists just tormenting their own people to get them on board with what they were trying to do.
Was there any sort of element in the British government or the British Empire more broadly that was supportive of the Rhodesians?
There was individual conservatives, and the public at large was actually quite sympathetic. But the problem was that the Commonwealth was now in existence, as well as the UN, and they would just get swamped by all these new African and Asian countries that wanted nothing less than one man, one vote, hand over Rhodesia now, like invade Rhodesia, armed force now, like send in the UN, Britain, you need to invade now. So like Britain was trying to play this game of trying to not implode the Commonwealth because all these Africans were threatening to pull out and leave unless Rhodesia was like thrown to the dogs, basically. So it was just this stupid balancing act, which always ended up on the Africa or the British choosing the African side at every opportunity, really.
And how much American influence was there? I know the Eisenhower administration and subsequent American regimes were very much on the decolonization train. Were they sort of tipping the scales in Britain's eyes, or against Rhodesia?
There didn't seem to be. There wasn't too much direct interference. Britain, by this point, obviously, there was always the general theme of America pushing Britain to decolonize and such. But no, this was. It seems very much to be Britain just sort of sabotaging herself, and obviously the Commonwealth. The US wasn't included, and that's where most of the pressure came from. All these like Africans just completely going insane and calling Rhodesia a threat to world peace, and like always calling for armed intervention and stuff. And the British tried dealing with them like they were like some normal civilized people, but obviously there was kind of like a one-way street during all these negotiations, and just never went anywhere. So no, it wasn't so much America. It's early on anyway. Later on, you have Kissinger and stuff sticking their noses in, but I think in the early stages, before independence and shortly after, it's very much Britain inflicting this upon her own colony.
So it's pretty safe to say that UDI was pretty much the Rhodesians had their hand forced by the British. There was no real alternative aside from just giving up their country to the Africans prematurely.
Yeah, the British were always asking for concessions. So like, you need to give the Africans more opportunities. You need to expand the franchise. Like, more of them have to vote and all this. And the Rhodesians would reply, "Okay, we'll play along. Like, can you say what you actually want?" And the British would be like, "No, suggest things to us." And they'd suggest things, and they'd always just be told no. And the British could never just directly say what they wanted, because in reality, all the other African nations would accept was just complete one man, one vote. So the Rhodesians were just banging their heads against the wall and going nowhere really there. So yeah, they were very much shoved into a corner. The British were just playing endlessly for time and just not talking around in circles, never offering anything really solid. They were just constantly evasive about actual solutions. So the Rhodesians really, the main problem at this point was emigration, because the future seemed so uncertain that the whites were beginning to leave. And there's only 250,000 whites at this point in Rhodesia. So obviously, even 1,000 whites leaving leaves a massive impact. And I think in 1964, there was like 8,000 left or something. So the situation really couldn't have been allowed to carry on for another year. Otherwise, Rhodesia was really crippling herself, really demographically. So yeah, Ian Smith's hand was forced by that point.
So in 1960, obviously the Congo crisis starts, and that's really kind of starting a lot of the dominoes in Africa. What kind of contribution did Rhodesia or the Rhodesians have to the Congo, and I guess further conflicts like the Biafra War and whatnot. I remember reading something about Rhodesian mercenaries contributing a pretty substantial force within the Congo crisis. I think it was to the Katangis.
I'm not actually sure about mercenary contributions in terms of actually the Rhodesians themselves. They were very sympathetic to the Katanganese, but obviously they couldn't get involved. And the sort of main impact was not Rhodesia upon the Congo, but rather the other way around, because the Federation still existed at this point, and Northern Rhodesia borders the Congo. So there was just floods of white refugees crossing into Northern Rhodesia, and all of these Belgians were just staying in people's houses, and they had all these horror stories to share, and like they're all like all these families were split up, and people were looking for their children and such, and everyone had these horror stories about rape and murder, and it was like all of the Rhodesians' worst sort of nightmares about African rule, sort of right on display next door. So their attitudes like really hardened after the Congo, because it's like, oh right, this is us next. They are just going to rape and kill us all. And we have all these first-hand experiences being told to us right here.
Were they taking the Belgians in, or were they?
Yeah. There was just a flood over the border into Rhodesia. Like the Belgians were just like getting in their car and bolting for the border, and the Rhodesian army was on standby at the border accepting these people.
What kind of what friends did Rhodesia have in this time? Leading up to UDI, immediately after UDI. Aside from the obvious, the South Africans and I believe the Portuguese, did they have any other friends abroad?
Nope, there was no friends really. It was even the South Africans were very sort of aloof, whereas the Portuguese were much more much more friendly, and said as much, like, we'll back you during UDI, basically to Smith beforehand. But no other country really stood up. Even the like white Commonwealth countries, so like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they had some like personal sympathy. Like the prime ministers would have personal sympathy, but they could just never, do anything for Rhodesia. Like there's just so many, so again, just so much pressure from all these other sort of non-white nations that they could just never take Rhodesia's side, and they would just sort of go with the flow, really. Obviously, later on, there was, there was like sort of a connection with Israel where they would provide weapons and such for Rhodesia, but diplomatically speaking, they weren't on Rhodesia's side.
Right, and UDI was at a very precarious point in history. The U.S. was so embroiled in Vietnam. The Commonwealth was obviously having their own implosion. It's almost like the initial years leading up to and immediately after UDI, Rhodesia was sort of a sideshow in many ways.
Yeah, obviously there was always a lot more important things going on, but the British and everyone else still somehow found time to make life hell for Rhodesia. And as you say, with Vietnam and such, once that wound down, the Rhodesians, obviously, I'm sure had a lot of volunteers, ex-Vietnam guys.
Is that sort of how the world saw Rhodesia at the start? Like, we have larger Cold War concerns going on right now. We'll sort of come back to this later. Was that the mindset?
Not really. They seem to be permanently in the news cycle. Like, despite everything else going on, it was just like racist Rhodesia, racist Rhodesia, racist Rhodesia, and obviously, like, all the Africans never shut up about it as well, because that's like their primary concern. So no, despite everything else going on, they were still, they were still in the headlines, and everyone was always had one eye on Rhodesia, I guess. Well, obviously the Americans are one thing and have bigger concerns, but the British and the Commonwealth, which is like half the world, if not more, they were always very focused on Rhodesia.
Yeah, and I know, just to talk within in the U.S., the the civil rights groups and the various black terrorists would always latch on to the Rhodesian conflict.
Yeah.
They would bomb like Rhodesian consulates, I think, and other Rhodesian expats. That was a pretty popular target throughout the 70s.
I actually didn't know that. I'd never even thought to look into how the Black Africans. I've covered Smith's visit to Rhodesia and things like that, but I didn't know about any consulate bombings or things like that.
Yeah, at that point in time in the United States, it was like the
Oh yeah, of
Black
course,
Liberation Army, all that stuff. They would just, they saw something white and they bombed it, basically.
Yeah.
So, obviously, UDI occurs in '65, and the Bush War starts to pick up. Where did the Bush War really start? Was it just a gradual escalation, or were there a few inciting incidents?
Yeah, I mean, the early attempts at infiltration into Rhodesia were much lower scale. They just sort of handed these terrorist guns and just said, "Hey, walk in," basically. And it wasn't even the Rhodesian army dealing with it. It was just like the police. They just went and just sort of easily killed like every single one of these people that infiltrated. A lot of them just like basically like starving to death. Like they just came in with no plan and they were just sort of like aimlessly wandering around the wilderness. It was just a total like nothing burger really for the Rhodesians, and for the first sort of 5, 6, 7, even like 8 years, there just wasn't much going on. It was just so low scale. Like obviously you had like the terror attacks, or like low scale terror attacks, and like Africans trying to infiltrate the country, but there was nothing like serious really happening yet. It was only sort of later on, after sort of the early 70s, when it really picked up. And then even then, life sort of semi went on as normal until the late 70s, and then it was just like it absorbing the whole country essentially. There was just too many sort of terrorists to keep a handle on things.
And so, how did the insurgency really get started? Was it homegrown? Were the communists sort of there from the start? The foreign communists, I mean, where were their bases? How are they building those up, etc.?
Yeah, so initially the only sort of route to go was from Zambia to the north, formerly Northern Rhodesia, and Joshua Nkomo's organization was up there, and they would send terrorists across the Zambezi River, which even in itself, crossing that is hard enough to do. And then, as I said, they just it's just these terrible sort of attempts at infiltrating the country where they just end up dying. But yeah, very very low scale, and the sort of recruits they were getting, like there wasn't much actual natural support in the country at that point. A lot of it was literally just kidnapping people and bringing them back to Zambia, where they would be trained and then sent across the border with a gun. Whereupon a lot of these people would just immediately sort of give up and go and hand their guns to the police and say what happened or whatever. There wasn't much enthusiasm there. It was only later really that the Africans sort of changed tactics a little bit and sort of looked at what Mao Zedong was up to in China or whatever, and started really trying to like light the whole country on fire and like make it like a mass popular uprising. Like the whole conventional stage at the start was just a disaster, as I said.
Were there any attempts to arrest or imprison Nkomo or Mugabe or any of the others at the start?
Yeah, they were both in detention for the longest time, but the British government urged the Rhodesians to let them go, which they did eventually, to try and like start negotiations, which just went nowhere. So Mugabe was in a cell for a very long time, and then the British forced them to let him go.
That's just fantastic. Great job, Rhodes.
It's ridiculous. Even like all the a lot of the white liberals in the country, they were like restricted. Like Garfield Todd, who I talked about recently, was like supporting the terrorists, and he was restricted to his ranch and like couldn't go out. But the British again interfered and said, "Hey, let him out." And they didn't really have much choice but to say yes if they wanted to do negotiations.
So were the Black nationalists, were they united at the start? Were they networking with other groups like I guess the ANC, or even prior to that, like Lumumba and his guys in the Congo? Was it like an overarching plan, or did they just sort of try to focus within Rhodesia without a larger like Pan-African movement?
So the split in Rhodesian African nationalism happened before the war, where Nkomo went his separate ways with Sithole, who was the initial leader of the splinter group, but then Mugabe obviously took over later. And there was also like sort of other less extreme movements or whatever. It was very fractured. Africans don't seem to be very good at working together. And even during the war, they were like killing each other. Like whenever they would find each other, they would just start killing each other. So they weren't very good on that front. There was cooperation with the ANC. One of the early operations, I think it might have been the first actually, when they crossed the Zambezi and tried to infiltrate Rhodesia. They did it with the ANC, which was very bizarre. And like they tried to reach South Africa, I believe, like the ANC men. And that's actually what triggered the South Africans to get directly involved in the conflict. And they offered tons of police, as well as like loads of I think about half of the Rhodesian Air Force, or maybe a third, was just like on loan from the South African security forces. And that was the result of the ANC working with the terrorists coming down from Zambia early on.
Did the I'll try to word this correctly. Did the black nationalists believe in anything, or was it just take over, kill Whitey?
They believed in whatever was convenient to get them their independence. Like the intricacies of communism or whatever didn't seem to occur to like the average, didn't like match the average person, like obviously. And like a lot of it is just sort of in African politics is just sort of respecting the strong man with the gun. Like there's no sort of like deep political like ideology going on there. Like I'm sure Mugabe was like an actual communist or whatever, but a lot of these figures like Joshua Nkomo doesn't seem to actually believe anything at all. He just seemed to like power and money. He was getting very heavily funded and got very fat during his exile in the UK off of like taxpayer money and like all this random funding. So I mean, Mugabe seemed more ideologically inclined, but obviously the average African just didn't care. Like the message was like kill Whitey, like literally kill Whitey. There wasn't much more, but there wasn't much deeper than that going on.
Yeah, that seems to be the sort of trend line with African Cold War politics. You know, like, oh, we've got our strong man Mobutu in the Congo. We'll call him an anti-communist, and then there's this strong man right across the border. We'll call him a communist because he opposes us, sort of deal.
That's pretty much what was going on. The Africans were just ideologically and name only loyal to whoever was funding or training them or whatever, which obviously Britain helped in some ways with the terrorists, but they can't like explicitly train and such. Like they offered them equipment and things, but they didn't offer anywhere near as much as the Soviets or the Chinese or the East Germans or whatever did.
And ZANU and ZAPU were largely divided primarily on tribal lines, if I'm not mistaken, with the Mashona and the Ndebele or something.
Yeah, Mugabe is a Mashona, so they were the former victim tribe, or like they were just permanently getting raided, like I said earlier, and they operated in the east of the country, which that's ZANU, and then ZAPU was Joshua Nkomo and his Matabele. And the Mashonas are infinitely more numerous than the Matabele, which is ultimately why Mugabe won out.
And then one of the first things he did was to just slaughter the other tribe.
Within like 5 years, he was committing genocide against the Matabele. And there were plenty of historical grievances there to trigger that. So yeah, and I think they still hate each other, so I don't think that's getting backed up anytime soon.
So what was the state of the Rhodesian security forces in the period sort of, I guess, after the Second World War leading up to UDI and right around that time in the mid-60s?
There was some concerns after the Federation broke up that the British would try and hold out, because obviously the armed forces had all been integrated, but they were actually quite generous with that. So the Rhodesians got quite a lot of the Air Force and such, and like all their army back and such. So they were in a pretty strong position. Like obviously, except South Africa, they were like by far the strongest in Africa. Like nothing could even compare. Like at these Commonwealth meetings where all the Africans are like spurging out, saying like, "Oh, invade Rhodesia now." I believe it was the Hastings Banda, who was the president of Malawi, was like, yeah, the Rhodesians with like one battalion could just invade all of East Africa right now. Like you guys are all told, like, what are you talking about? And it was pretty true. Like there was like the Zambians and such later on were given equipment like jets and stuff by the British, but like they just didn't know how to work them. And just like no matter how much you trained them, they just couldn't figure it out. And later in the war, ZANU were found to have like tanks, and because again they just had no idea how to use them. Like they'd have East German trainers and all sorts, like trying to teach them how to do it, and they just couldn't figure it out. So the Rhodesians obviously just in terms of quality, it was just so far like a different planet to what they're actually fighting against. So that's sort of why you saw like there was obviously like the three key operations during the Bush War were Dingo, Eland, and Gatling, and in each case, it's like the Rhodesians lose like one man, and the Africans lose like 1,000 or more, because they can just, if the Africans are actually grouped up and not, spread across the country, like infiltrating, doing terrorism, like if they're bunched up, it's just over. They just hit the base and kill everyone. So yeah, there's just no competition, sort of armed forces wise.
So I know in the case of South Africa, there's a few stories of South African paras and other guys encountering white enemy combatants speaking like German or Russian or something like that. Were there ever any instances of the Rhodesians engaging or encountering comm-block trainers of the Africans?
Yeah, especially towards the end of the war, when they went on raids into Mozambique, which by that point was occupied not occupied, but ZANU were allowed to operate out of Mozambique. The Rhodesians would go in and hit their bases and stuff. And they would find like East German trainers, or like they would see white men and things like that. I don't think I ever read an account of white combatants, but yeah, only trainers, and even then, very small numbers.
So in the lead up to the Bush War, the Rhodesian security forces they're doing their thing. They're coming straight out of the Malayan emergency, where a lot of modern counterinsurgency doctrine comes out of, and the Rhodesians obviously got a lot of experience in that conflict. How were they adopting the military to those counterinsurgency tactics?
Yeah, so initially the response was very unconventional. It was only sort of later when the Selous Scouts was formed, where the Rhodesians really came into their own in terms of like being like unique experts at counterinsurgency. The leader was Ron Reed Daly, who served in the SAS in Malaya. Their tactics, which were the most effective, were I mean, this shows how like sort of fickle African politics is, like how African sort of violence is even. They would capture terrorists, and then they would just say to them like, "Hey, yeah, we're gonna like hang you and kill you because you're a terrorist, or you can just come and join us and like kill your old friends." And like almost every time they just be like, "Yeah, okay," and they would just operate these sort of like pseudo groups that would just go out and act like terrorists and mix with the terrorists. And I think there was literally only like one occasion where a terrorist ever like turned back again and like turned his guns on his own men. Like the rest of it was just, yeah, like you could just seamlessly convert these former terrorists who were like screaming "kill Whitey" and like killing civilians 5 minutes ago into like your own guys that are just mixing in with the enemy terrorists and just killing them all spontaneously. And they were responsible, like that tiny unit was responsible for like I think 67% of like enemy casualties or something stupid, because it was just they just had no means of dealing with it. Like the Africans had no sort of like sophisticated like intelligence networks or anything like that. Like they had no way of telling who was real and who wasn't. So it was just like absolute panic, like behind the amongst all the Africans. Like they were all suspecting each other of being like these, like they'd refer to them like ghosts or whatever, or like some kind of like demons or whatever. Like they'd always like be looking over their shoulder. So it was just absolute chaos in terms of the Rhodesian tactics. Like there was just no counter to it really.
And were throughout the conflict, were the Africans adapting really, or were they just sort of trying to do the same thing over and over?
Well, they certainly realized that conventional warfare just wasn't going to work. So even later on, like they were always bunched up in these bases in like these camps in Zambia and Mozambique. From there, they would infiltrate Rhodesia in small groups, and like obviously that is a lot harder to deal with because you can't just like send in the Rhodesian Air Force and like pummel it or whatever. But like the actual like during the training or whatever, that was when they were the most vulnerable and when they took the most casualties. And later on, they would like sort of disperse themselves out into these smaller camps. But like even then, the camps kept getting hit. So like they would try, like they would try and spread out more. And effectively, in the end, it was pretty much raw numbers. Like the Rhodesians they were like bleeding out through emigration, and with sanctions, like they couldn't maintain their air force. Or like there just wasn't enough men to go around. And they had like conscription as well. So it was I forget the exact time period, but it was like 4 weeks on, 4 weeks off, or something like that. And it was just completely unsustainable. Like as like the country couldn't function with like all of the male population essentially having to like leave their jobs and like spend half of their time chasing terrorists around the country. Like it was just impossible. So it was just raw numbers essentially at the end. Like there was just so many terrorists infiltrating all over the country. And it was like whack-a-mole. Like there just wasn't enough men to deal with the problem. Like you're just impossible, completely impossible. So by the end of the war, there was just large portions of the country, which were just like essentially under terrorist control. Obviously, most of that would be wilderness or like African areas or whatever. But still, like if you're a farmer or whatever, life was just unlivable.
Was there ever any chance of any sort of Rhodesian victory or negotiated settlement, or was the die just sort of cast right at the start?
Yeah, the die was pretty much cast at the start. There was never really any way of them sustaining like a prolonged guerrilla war. Like obviously they could inflict greater casualties or whatever, but just in a pure numbers game, like there's just so many Africans. The Rhodesians were no more than 5% of the population, and there was always negotiations ongoing. But it was the same issue where Britain just wouldn't accept anything really. And towards the end, there was an internal settlement where the Rhodesians negotiated with sort of the less extreme groups. And, they tried involving Nkomo, but he wouldn't do it. Nkomo effectively could have become the president of Rhodesia had he just accepted, but instead he, during the negotiations, shot down an airliner full of white people and killed them all, which wasn't very wise because obviously then he just became like persona non grata. So instead they dealt with all these sort of like local chiefs and like less extreme characters, and it worked. They had like an internal settlement, which most Africans were happy with. But Britain didn't recognize it, and they insisted that you have to have Nkomo or Mugabe, like choose the extremist communists instead of these like normal Africans, please. So that fell apart very quickly, and yeah, Britain would accept nothing less than like hand your country over to communist terrorists now, please.
Yeah. So to skip through the rest of the Bush War and focus in on right at the end. So how the settlement occurs, the British are forcing the Rhodesians to accept the communist victory. If I'm not mistaken, the British they sent a peacekeeper force in 1980 to oversee the elections, and then everything just falls apart from there. What was it like? Right at the end, everything's falling apart. It's 1980, and the whole country's over. What are the whites doing? What's the situation like?
So a lot of the whites were falling into this sort of like weird cope where they're like, oh, I won't be so bad. Like, let's just accept it. It's fine. Even to the point of like high up people like Ken Flower, who ran the Central Intelligence Organization. He was like essentially working with the British by this point and like informing them of any plans that might like mess up this Operation Courts and things like that, which would have seen the Rhodesians assassinate Mugabe or whatever. Like he was just passing this all along to the British because it's like some of the Rhodesians were just so deep in this like layers of cope where it's like, oh, let's just end the fighting, guys. Come on, it won't be so bad. Just hand it over. It's fine. And a lot of people at the end just completely deluded themselves. It's like, oh no, Mugabe won't win. These more like these less extreme guys will win. And it was just so obviously not going to happen. And like Mugabe's goons were running all over the country, like intimidating all the like tribes or whatever into like voting for him. So like and it was just completely unchecked with all the British there, and all these reports are being brought to the British by like Ian Smith and like the Rhodesian like army, and they're like, hey, yeah, Mugabe's goons are like, you know, like beating and killing people. Can you do something about it? Like, should this disqualifies them? And the British would admit all the wrongdoing or whatever and be like, oh, now we can't act, but even like we should, but we can't. But Mugabe's not going to win, don't worry. And then he won. So, and by that point, everyone's just in disbelief. And right after the victory, there was just like a massive like the housing market just like tanked. Everyone was like trying to sell their houses or whatever, and then Mugabe was like, reconciliation, guys, reconciliation. I love Whitey. And then, you know, there was a bit of cope for a while, and like a lot of people tried to stick it out, but obviously, you know, that didn't last very long.
How were the whites treated overall in that period right after the end?
There wasn't much immediately after Mugabe took over, and this isn't actually something I've even gotten to for my book yet, because I sort of stopped rather abruptly in 1980, but I'm going to carry on further. But it seems that, you know, it wasn't, it was bad, like in terms of like decay and like isolated incidents or whatever, but, you know, it really sort of took off later when Mugabe tried sort of like getting the farms and handing them out to his war veterans. Only then did it sort of become like actual hell. But before that, it was just like typical African decline rather than like explicitly targeted sort of genocide.
So throughout the history of Rhodesia, obviously we see quite a few developments, lessons to be taken, you know, from the various conflicts, and right at the end especially. What do you think the main lessons that we should learn from Rhodesia are, you know, for nationalists, for the situation that we're in right now, stuff to emulate, stuff to avoid?
More than anything else, it's sort of well, racial differences. Like this sort of like worldview where everyone's like this blank slate, and you know, people can adopt others' cultures, or like all this silly nonsense. Like Rhodesia just proves that ultimately, like, people are what they are. Africans can't run a country, and you can't run a country full of Africans. Like it's just like the racial differences in terms of like quality is just so stark in Rhodesia, where you know, like a fluctuating number of whites between like 200 and 300,000 can run like a functioning massive country the size of Great Britain, whereas like all these Africans just can't. It just falls apart immediately. It's just a warning really for our future more than anything else. Like if you just allow yourself to be swamped by Africans, then unless you can just like rule with an iron fist and like not give them any voting rights, then your country is just going to go to shit. They will vote for themselves, and like they will always pursue their own interests, even if life gets worse for them. Like you know, under Mugabe, obviously Africans came off worse than anyone else, and like they don't care. Like they will never they will never learn that lesson. Like you're not going to make other races like let you rule them effectively. So I mean, I guess just we can't coexist. Essentially, is the message.
Do you think the West is in a similar situation to Rhodesia, or is there still a way out?
We aren't there just yet, but once we become a minority, then, you know, we're in the exact same boat once again. Like in South Africa, the population distribution was what, 1/4 white, a bit less, 1/5. You know, that's not a million miles away. Like once we hit 50%, you know, under there, you're entering very dangerous territory, and all democratic, any like democratic way out is like off the table, because we exist in countries where it is one man, one vote, and you know, once the minorities have over 50%, they are just going to vote to take your stuff, and then they're going to kill you. So yeah, you know, all that matters is sending these people back where they came from, essentially, because you know, once in our current system, once we're a minority, there's no way out legally. Like they will just vote to destroy you, and you no amount of pandering to them is going to save you. Like obviously in the US, like you sort of have to suck it up in some regards with the GOP. Like there's this like incessant pandering to blacks or like Hispanics or whatever from Trump. And you kind of have to, because otherwise you can't win elections. And the worse the demographics get, the more you have to pander, and eventually there's nothing you can give them. Like they're just gonna take their own side. So yeah.
Awesome. I've appreciated listening to you guys. I haven't had any questions that were worth interrupting the conversation for up until this point, but I think this kind of segues into my next question. I guess kind of like looking back on Rhodesia, I've spoken with a lot of guys on the right, typically more on like the dissident right, like TRS kind of spectrum.
My favorite. Right.
And they tend to basically view Rhodesia as like it was some Western imperialism for the sake of capital, right? It did nothing to benefit the British people. Is there any merit to that claim, or?
No, it's just, yeah, I've obviously had a lot of arguments with these types, and it's just like they do just ultimately, these people just ultimately believe in like wholesome Chungus, like everyone have their own countries, like we love everyone sort of nationalism that you see from like Irish people or whatever a lot. And like they'll see Rhodesia where like, they like there'll be like some white guy on like his massive estate with like all these like blacks working for him or whatever, and like their first thought when we're like, wow, look what we created from nothing, and like we've got all these people working for us, and like we're ruling over these people. They just look at it like in the same way as a leftist almost. It's just like, oh, yeah. Like they're like, you evil racist, basically. It's just like, what are we doing? Like,
right.
Like this is Jewish. Like ruling over Africans is Jewish or whatever,
Right.
Or like some nonsense like that. Like there's no nuance at all. Like any situation, like the British Empire in general just gets dismissed by these people because it's like Jews also benefited. Like Jews were involved in like the diamond and gold trade in like Africa. This all sucks. I hate it. Kill Whitey now. It's like, yeah. I support Mugabe nationalism. It's like, what? Like, what are we doing? Yeah.
I think a lot of it comes from like, these people have been catechized into like leftist presuppositions. So I think a lot of them came into the right with those presuppositions originally. Like I know there's a huge contingent that came in like after October 7th and like Gaza and stuff. And they're like, this is why we're on the right, to oppose Israeli imperialism. And they have been kind of steered in the right direction to the point where they don't frame it quite like that anymore. But I think they still hold a lot of presuppositions about what is moral, right, and what is good that have to kind of be erased.
Yeah, a lot of people are just sort of wholesome Chungus, I love everyone liberals at heart, and they got tilted over the edge by one too many like explicit like murders that sort of made them slightly racist, or like they just hyper focus on Israel or whatever.
Right.
It's not a very coherent way of looking at the world. You can just sort of like pick your own side. It's a lot easier.
Yeah, it tends to lack like a positive vision for their own people, right? Like,
yeah, we're not free until those Palestinians that have zero chance of winning somehow break out of their like tiny enclosure in the corner of
right.
Israel and somehow prevail against this country of 10 million people and infinite funds. Like
right.
any day now, guys.
And then
once they win, we are free. Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to go too far off topic, but like they love that Israel destabilizes the Middle East, so then we get Middle Eastern refugees. But then what happens if the Middle East destabilizes Israel? Where do
we can just say no? Like you can just close the border,
right? Like, well, we haven't done that before, but now we get right. If the current trends continue, we get flooded with millions of more Jews from Israel.
Yeah. Like I can never. This question is never answered for me. Where it's just like they'll super duper care about all these brown people, but like when it comes to Jews, it's like destroy Israel, and it's like, okay, where are you sending the Jews then? It's just like
Right.
and the implication is just like, oh, we're gonna kill them all, but it's like, dude, like, and they'll talk to you about being like a spurg, like low IQ nationalist or whatever, because like you want to like deport Browns and you're being like vulgar about it, but then it's just like their entire worldview is just like kill Jews. It's like, oh, dude, like what are we doing?
Yeah.
You know, I see a lot of some of the recent actions that the Trump administration has been doing, some of the stuff they've been posturing to do. Venezuela comes to mind, and what seems to be the inevitable in Cuba up here soon. Um, when I see actions like this, I think of like the Rhodesians with Operation Eland and Operation Dingo, etc., where we're essentially taking our military power to go abroad and strike these hostile forces that are actively interfering, in our countries, causing, untold issues, being this immigration source for millions and millions of foreigners to come into our country. So I see our strikes on that as essentially us trying to deal with that problem, such that we'll be able to then, solve some of our internal problems. And I think it's a very like Rhodesian way of going about it, whether or not that's intentional on the administration's side of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what when that happened, I tweeted out. I didn't like give like a political take or whatever. I just tweeted like third world nationalism isn't real. Like you can just kidnap their president, and like it is true. Like we just sort of pretend all these like third world countries are like functional or like equal to us or whatever. But like ultimately, you can just and obviously there's different people benefit from each situation or whatever. Like a lot of people just dismiss the Venezuela thing because it's like, oh, this also benefits Israel or whatever, and like that's the only prism they view the world from. But like ultimately, regardless, like yeah, you can just sort of rock up to these people's countries and just like take their shit. Like that was why we like ruled the whole world. Like obviously the US, like in their own way, sort of ruled over like the rest of the Americas, and Britain had like all of Africa and Asia. Because like these people can't run their own countries. Like they have no means of defending themselves. Like in reality, like they can posture, but you can just rock up and like do them in like an hour.
If there's anything that our history tells us, whether it's American or British, Rhodesian, etc., is that the most dangerous force in the world is a few scrappy white men with nothing to lose.
Yeah.
That is true.
All right. Well, Mr. Zimmer Historian, thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. Before we cut the stream, do you have any plugs you'd like to mention?
Yeah, since I'm banned on YouTube now, I am mostly on Substack. My name on there is just Zoomer Historian. I'm also on Rumble, Zoomer Historian Real over there because someone stole my name. But yeah, mostly Substack, and obviously I'm on Twitter as well at Zoomer Historian.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, sir. We'll see you all next week.
No problem. Anytime.
Thank you, Zoomer.
No worries.